In southwestern Ecuador, there is a fossil site called Tanquiloma that contains one of the strangest prehistoric burial pits. Within its layers lie thousands upon thousands of bone fragments belonging to giant ground sloths. These giant herbivores once roamed across the Americas. But what makes this place especially strange is not just the massive number of dead animals, not even that they all died at nearly the same time, but rather how they died. Because, as paleontologists would discover, these giants met their end in the most undignified way imaginable, and one of the strangest deaths. We'll talk about that later. But for now, I want to emphasize that this is just one of many bizarre deaths in Earth's history. And although I consider myself somewhat knowledgeable about fossilized deaths, having studied many grim, brutal victims and other unjust deaths frozen in time thanks to fossils, recently, I wondered about deaths that are less brutal, simply rare, random, and bizarre. Deaths that make you wonder how it could possibly happen. And after a bit of research, I found some deaths that I believe are the most unbelievable imaginable. Let's start strong. This first fossil, or rather, these fossils are quite peculiar, and everything begins in Ecuador, as I mentioned. Here, at the Tanquiloma site, you will find the remains of thousands upon thousands of bone fragments belonging to a large group of mammals called giant ground sloths, and more specifically, the genus Eremotherium, an extremely massive herbivore that makes modern sloths look ridiculous. It weighed about 4.5 tons and was about 6 meters long. When standing up, it was 3 times taller than an average person, comparable to an elephant more than its modern relatives. And this extended to its skeleton, which was absurdly sturdy and dense, so it was clearly very difficult to bring down. However, at Tanquiloma, researchers discovered nearly 24 of these giants had fallen. They didn't just die in the area, but they died at the same time. Their end occurred between 18,000 and 23,000 years ago. At first, it seemed quite clear that something had killed them, because like the asphalt pits in the United States, this place had quite a bit of asphalt. This suggested that the sloths were rapidly buried in a sticky asphalt hell. It seeped through the wetlands where they lived. However, the strange thing was that the asphalt only covered part of their bodies, not all of them, whereas in the asphalt pits, most bones were completely submerged. So this idea was discarded, and frankly, dying from asphalt would have been more pleasant, because as they continued digging, they found something strange, a complete layer surrounding the sloths consisting of chewed and digested plants. Simply put, it was a complete layer of feces, large enough to cover a group that collectively weighed over 80 tons. We're talking about a level 2 that would make Ian Malcolm take notice, and you'd think this discovery would lead to more confusion. But for the research team, it wasn't confusing at all. It was precisely the evidence they were looking for. It led to the hypothesis that the death of these giants was caused by themselves, or rather by their stomachs. Initially, they ate plants in this place, then excreted the remains into a pond, which at the time was a shallow pool of water. But gradually, over time, these bathroom visits accumulated, turning the pond into a desperate cesspool of toxins, where bacteria, parasites, and all sorts of things proliferated, potentially causing disgusting diseases for the sloths. While they rolled around and drank water contaminated with pathogens beyond their tolerance. You may find it hard to believe, but this idea is based on a real incident. In the 1970s, it was observed in Tanzania in a herd of 140 hippos taking refuge in a pond during a drought. Soon, their massive amount of waste turned that refuge into doom, and within a few weeks, the entire herd perished. They lost over 100 members to disease or poisoning. In fact, the soil around the final resting place of the sloths suggests they ended up in a situation exactly in the same way due to a drought forcing them to take shelter in an area with food and water. That sounds like good news, but in this case, the cramped space condemned them unknowingly. An unglamorous and somewhat muddy end, however. Not every strange death is unpleasant. Let the frogs tell you, more specifically. Frogs from 45 million years ago were found in a pit in the Geiseltal region, Germany. To date, we are not sure what species they belong to, but believe they belong to the family Pelobatidae, which still exists. In total, hundreds of individual fossil frogs have been identified in this cemetery. At that time, it was a vast swamp and a refuge for amphibians. So why did it seem to have killed so many over a long period? The researchers had no idea, and for decades it was considered an unsolved mystery, because all the frogs seemed completely healthy at death, with no signs of disease, old age, predation, or so the only thing paleontologists could consider was their location and quantity, which obviously wasn't much. Initially, the only reasonable idea was that their home had dried up quickly, but if so, they could have gone elsewhere, given the abundance of swamps in the area. So this idea was discarded, however. A few years ago, after observing live frogs, paleontologists believe they have cracked the problem. The answer is essentially that these frogs live too much. Specifically, they noticed that in some species of frogs and toads today, a major source of mortality is mating, because during the stressful breeding season, many often become exhausted after or during mating. This causes them to drown, especially females being pushed underwater by males in some groups. They also realized that these Geyserville frogs probably lived on land and only returned to the swamp to breed, and therefore they were not good swimmers, making these deadly frenzies more common and lethal. Although the frogs were having fun, drowning is not a good way to die. Perhaps the only consolation is that it doesn't last long. Like the death of another prehistoric animal, an extremely unlucky pterosaur. It died in such a strange way that we know of no other similar fossil. The pterosaur in question is a Ludodactylus, a pterosaur from the early Cretaceous in Brazil, quite large. It was already interesting because it looked almost exactly like a child's toy of a pteranodon. And another interesting thing is, it's holotype specimen for obvious reasons. You don't need a degree in paleontology to recognize something is wrong. But the detail is a bit more subtle. That mass you see seems to have become part of the jaw of Ludodactylus. That is a yucca leaf, a plant still found in many countries. But how did a leaf become part of it? From the body of a pterosaur, one might think it was trying to eat it and, like a sharp Dorito, it stabbed straight into its mouth. But look at those teeth. This guy was not a herbivore, but the paleontologist who discovered this pterosaur estimated that, while flying at high speed, the poor thing crashed. It plunged straight into a yucca plant, which for those who don't know, its leaves are called Adam's needle, or Spanish bayonet, not without reason. And in fact, some studies have linked it to an increase in gardening injuries, something Ludodactylus learned that day. And the leaf was lodged in its lower jaw. That must have been very painful. And unfortunately for it, that was just the beginning of its suffering, because in the following days, the injured pterosaur would gradually die. It couldn't eat or drink with its deformed mouth while the wound became infected. Surely, it tried to remove the green spear, but its efforts were futile, and it eventually died from the accident. And as I said, since the discovery, no other fossils of death by leaf have been found, and perhaps that is not too surprising. It turns out that plants and trees in general are much more brutal than one might think, and we know of other cases where they violently finished off an animal. In this exclusive club, there is a Cretaceous turtle impaled by a tree, a most unusual combination. Surprisingly, this find is only part of a larger discovery, as it comes from the Tanis fossil site in North Dakota. This is the only known formation that has preserved animals killed directly by the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs, and I think this fits the video. Because dying from a meteor is rare, bizarre, and given the condition of the fossils, painful. To illustrate, you should know that besides the impaled turtle, other notable deaths include many types of fish, both marine and freshwater. All were found in chaos kilometers inland and with gills full of molten debris. In other words, they died from inhaling lava, in addition to finding an ant nest full of meteorite fragments, a Thescelosaurus mummified by injection, and many groups of non-avian dinosaurs were destroyed by the violent waves. Unfortunately, the area is private and many fossils found are still hidden from the public. So who knows? What else is waiting to be discovered? Another detail. Interestingly, the victims are often preserved in three-dimensional form, while normally fossils are crushed, and it is thought that this is because the violent waves clustered many victims together, basically like sardines in a can. And what is astonishing is that this formation is about 3,000 kilometers from the impact site. The distance between Cairo and Paris, even at that distance, life in the area suffered massive earthquakes, tsunamis up to 100 meters high, a powerful shockwave, and a rain of microtectites, small natural glass fragments formed during the impact. So, in other words, it was a bad day. And another thing completely beyond the victim's control is the case of a very unlucky rhinoceros. It suffered its own bizarre and brutal death. To see that, we will have to go to the Cappadocia region of Turkey, a unique place with its landscapes. Surreal, almost otherworldly, with countless strange formations. Its formation is not due to aliens, but to massive volcanic eruptions from 3 ancient volcanoes that occurred. Millions of years ago, lava erupted everywhere and formed a rugged terrain. This terrain led to some interesting discoveries. At least in my opinion, the most interesting one was excavated in 2012, when scientists discovered a solitary Ceratotherium, which is the same genus as the modern white rhinoceros. This specimen belonged to an extinct species of that genus, though slightly smaller than its living relatives, but by no means small, as it weighed over 2 tons. However, it seemed to have been crushed like an insect. The research team only found the head, remarkably well preserved, with strange features, such as a rough and wrinkled surface. Meanwhile, the inside of its teeth was extremely brittle and eroded. Signs indicated that this rhino had been fried, dehydrated, and baked at the same time. It was cooked to such an extent that they could only think of one possibility. Due to its geographical location, this incredibly unlucky rhino was caught in a Vesuvius-style eruption that completely engulfed it. A wave of lava exceeding 400 degrees Celsius completely covered it. Clearly, the pain must have been unimaginable. But fortunately, or depending on your perspective, it seems this Ceratotherium did not endure the lava for too long. Soon after, it was struck by a pyroclastic flow. The fast and hot flow of gas, ash, and volcanic rock, combined with the lava, tore apart its entire body. This explains why, despite being in perfect condition, only the skull was found. It turns out that prehistoric rhinos in general have a strange tendency to be fossilized in lava, as we know of another case. This happened in the US, where a similar thing occurred, but with a stranger twist. In Washington state, a bizarre cave was discovered nearly 100 years ago. It had a strange shape. It was shallow and had 2 pointed parts on top and 1 protrusion on the left. After some study, researchers realized that the shape was not random. It was the result of a mold that formed around a real animal. In this case, it was a rhino, likely Diceratherium, a North American genus from the late Oligocene to Miocene. It's hard to believe that a fossil could be a cave, but nearby skeletal remains of this animal supported that idea, as did the fact that the cave had the perfect shape of a dead rhino lying on its back. The fact that it was on its back was key, as that is commonly seen in large animals that have died, bloated, and floated on water. Quite specific. But this specificity gave paleontologists the most likely story of what happened to this poor rhino. It is believed that one day, while bathing in mud in a water source, it was interrupted by a volcanic eruption spewing lava towards it, but not too quickly, and it likely died from indirect heat and toxic gases before the lava touched it. A perhaps more painful and prolonged end. When the rhino died, it began to bloat and float to the surface, adopting the classic posture. Then the lava reached the water and its body, encasing it in a hot tomb. Meanwhile, the water quickly cooled the lava, forming a natural mold in which it was buried. Then, over millions of years, wind erosion cut the mold into 2 halves, exposing it to the world and completing the process of turning it into an actual cave. After learning about this case, I hope that someday we will also discover a dinosaur cave, but my intuition tells me that the chances are not high. And unfortunately, the odds are also low when it comes to learning about another extremely rare prehistoric death, that of a creature not too unfamiliar to us, Australopithecus. No, I'm not talking about the famous specimen Lucy, who may have died unhappily from a fall from a tree, but about AL 333, a large collection of bones and teeth known as the First Family, located in the Afar Triangle, Ethiopia. This discovery dates back about 3.2 million years and contains the remains of possibly more than 17 Australopithecus individuals of various ages, but all seem to belong to the same family. It is very rare to find a group of early hominids dying in the same place at the same time, which has attracted great interest, and making it one of the most unique fossil deaths we know. However, Not only what was found makes this site strange, but also the nature of their death. And although exactly what happened is still unknown, the most plausible hypotheses are equally rare and unusual. Initially, it was thought that the cause was a sudden flood, which is quite common in mass die-offs. But evidence from the surrounding sediments ruled out this idea. Therefore, a new hypothesis was put forward, pointing to the darkest possibility, that this place was the scene of a unique massacre, carried out not by other hominids, but by true man-eaters. The question is by whom. Given the number of hominids killed, it must have been a pack predator. This made the ancient giant hyena the prime suspect. But they usually devour bones and leave almost nothing, and in this case there are too many remains for it to be them. So attention turned to the only remaining possible culprit. Large felines, some known to hunt in packs and kill excessively, that is to say, killing more prey than they can eat. They usually avoid bones, but occasionally get calcium by swallowing some bones, often finger and toe bones, which happen to be missing in large numbers from AL 333. This led to the assumption that, if predators were responsible, it was the cat family, becoming the prime suspect. Saber-toothed cats like Homotherium, Megatherium, or Dinofelis. Not everyone agrees with this hypothesis. Questions are raised as to how one or more predators could kill over a dozen Australopithecus at once, and we also don't know whether these cats lived in packs. Hence, a second hypothesis emerges, less bloody but equally chaotic, suggesting that this family had great bad luck with dinner by eating something that caused severe food poisoning, to the extent that in a short time they all died, although it's not unheard of for poisoning to kill many animals in a short time. Some researchers think this is an exaggeration, given their vegetarian diet and the fact that almost all died in the same place. But ultimately, this strange case remains full of mystery and is not unique, because there is another strange case that for a while was also a complete mystery, with fossils formed not from one but from two different animal species. Jurassic Tharsis fish and contemporary belemnites, a type of cephalopod, began appearing together a few years ago, in the same fossil with a strange posture similar to the case of the pterosaur and the leaf. It should have been obvious what was happening. But if you need a hint, you are seeing two animals merge not side by side, but the belemnite inside the fish. And not just one fossil. The strangest thing is that many almost identical fossils have been found, which leads to the understandable question. What the hell were they doing in the Jurassic? Admittedly, the Jurassic period was already known to be crazy, but finding many animal specimens impaled on each other is still strange, with very few clues. The first step is clearly to determine who ate whom, but even this is difficult. The belemnite would almost certainly never attempt to take on such a large fish, and although they have a hard internal shell that can pierce anything at high speed, their species is not known for using them in reverse. For its part, the Tarsus fish was larger, but a small predator known to eat decomposing soft tissue and suspended organic debris, and therefore does not hunt squid half its length. So the detective work only took place a few weeks ago. A breakthrough was made when paleontologists noticed a peculiarity in all the cephalopods involved. They had many bivalves growing on them, a sign that they may have died before being impaled. This led to the hypothesis that having died and filled with small animals, these belemnites began to float to the surface because their internal shells were filled with gas. When they reached the surface, they became deadly traps for Tarsus, which tend to suck in floating objects. Normally, the size difference between the fish and the object or its shape would prevent disaster. But in this situation, the unusual size of the fish and the aerodynamic design of the belemnite's rostrum made such predicaments surprisingly common, where the pointed part of the cephalopod slid straight into the Tarsus's mouth, entering its gills. Nothing pleasant. Unable to escape the makeshift harpoon, it suffocated to death. So there you have it, a collection of some of the strangest deaths preserved in the fossil record, from giant sloths literally drowning in their own waste, to frogs dying from overenthusiasm, and perhaps the strangest of all are these deaths. These are just the deaths we have found and tried to understand. For every bizarre fossil death we discover, there are millions, if not billions, of others we never know about. Whether because they didn't fossilize or because we haven't found them yet, These fossils serve not just curiosity or revulsion. They are windows into the past, showing that life has always been unpredictable, sometimes cruel, and often bizarre. It's a reminder. Despite all our technology and knowledge, we are still subject to the whims of bad timing and Mother Nature. Furthermore, it proves that no matter how powerful you are, whether a 4-ton sloth or a 4-meter-long flying reptile, nature, physics, and randomness always find a way to humble you. So next time you're having a bad day, remember this: at least you're not a Jurassic fish with a dead squid stuck in its gills. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next video.